By late 1982, Chicago's nightmare had a face, a name, and finally, a survivor who could speak it aloud. Beverly Washington's courage cracked open a case that had swallowed women whole. Her description of a red van and a man with a feather hanging from the mirror gave detectives something they hadn't had in 2 years, a direction. The city's predators had ruled long enough. Now the hunt was turning inward. What followed wasn't a single arrest, it was a chain reaction. Edward Spreitzer's nerves snapped first, spilling pieces of horror he could barely understand himself. Then came the Kokoraleis brothers, Andrew and Thomas, each confession twisting against the other, contradicting, amplifying, and exposing how deep Robin Gecht's control had gone. The interrogation rooms of Villa Park in DuPage County became confessionals of madness. 4 men revealing their own mythology under fluorescent lights. What they revealed shocked even veteran homicide detectives. Rituals carried out in a suburban attic, trophies of flesh preserved in boxes, and a hierarchy of fear where obedience mattered more than life. But those same confessions also raised impossible questions. Who was telling the truth? How could every man describe the same rituals differently? And if Gecht truly commanded the violence, why did the legal system bend just enough to spare him? Tonight, we step into that fracture, the moment when investigation met insanity. We'll trace how one woman's survival brought the crew down, how forensics finally aligned with rumor, and how prosecutors tried to map order into chaos. Because once the talking began, the line between guilt, manipulation, and self-preservation blurred into static, a noise that still echoes through Chicago's case files. This is Dark Dialogue, the breaking point. The night the killers started confessing and the truth became another kind of nightmare. Hey Angela, how's it going tonight?
Hi John, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, really good. Yeah.
I'm interested in the confessions.
Yeah, you interested to hear how that went?
Yeah, let's hear how that went.
Pretty freaking jacked up story thus far, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they all told a different story?
Just
Wow, how is that? Okay.
Well, welcome listeners. You're listening to Dark Dialogue, where we dive into the crimes that haunt small towns and big cities alike. I'm your host, John.
And I'm Angela. And John, you know October is one of my favorite times of the year. The nights get darker, the stories get creepier, and it just feels right to lean into these haunting cases. Even though it's now November, we're continuing our October special episodes because a family emergency kept us from posting on schedule. It happens. And we missed most of the month.
Yes, we did. And if there was ever a case dark enough to carry that Halloween energy straight through November, it's this one. Tonight, we're stepping into the breaking point of the Chicago Ripper crew, the moment when their reign of ritual and blood finally collided with justice.
This is where everything starts to unravel. The red van is no longer a mystery. The survivors are finally being heard, and the city is beginning to realize just how close it came to hell. Detectives are piecing together confessions, contradictions, and pure madness. All from men who once followed Robin Gecht like a god.
Exactly. We'll cover how Edward Spreitzer's capture set off a chain reaction of arrests, how the Kokoraleis brothers cracked under interrogation, and how those confessions revealed the true scope of their crimes and their lies. We'll also break down the forensic breakthroughs that tied it all together and the critical role of survivors like Beverly Washington, whose courage forced this nightmare into the light.
And like always, listener discretion is strongly advised. These next chapters involve graphic violence and assault, but they also show how survivors and investigators fought to bring justice to the forgotten.
Before we dive in, take a second to support the show. It helps us keep these stories alive. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that thumbs up, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss an episode.
And if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Podbean, follow the show, leave us a review, and share the episode with your fellow true crime fans. It takes just a second and it makes a huge difference.
You can also follow us on social media for case photos, updates, and bonus content from every show in the Dark Dialogue Network.
All right, the streets of Chicago were quiet for now, but in 1982 they were filled with fear, flashing lights, and the sound of handcuffs finally closing.
The killers are caught. The confessions are coming, and the truth is about to get even darker. I'm your host, John.
And I'm Angela.
And this is Dark Dialogue, because the past doesn't stay buried, not in Chicago, and not in the voices that finally decided to talk. Before the arrests, before the confessions, before Chicago even realized the cult of killers was hunting its streets, it all began here. The murder of Linda Sutton, May 23rd, 1981. June 1st, the discovery of Sutton's body behind the Brer Rabbit Motel. February 12th of 82, the unnamed victim. May 15th, Lorianne Borowski was abducted and murdered. May 29th of 82, Shui Mock was abducted. June 13th, Angel York was attacked, and remember, she survived. August 28th of 82, Sandra Delaware was found murdered. September 8th, 82, Rose Davis was found murdered. September 11th, Carol Pappas disappears. September the 30th, Shui Mock's body was finally recovered. October 6th, Rafael Tirado was killed and Alberto Rosario was wounded. Again on October 6th, Beverly Washington was attacked and she survived. And October 10th of 82, Lorraine Borowski's body was finally found. So from 1981 to 1982, 13 months of terror left Chicago scarred, but the survivors, Angel York and Beverly Washington, refused to stay silent. Their words would lead detectives straight to the men behind the ritual, and that's where we pick up next. The capture of Edward Spreitzer and the van that finally stopped rolling. When police found Beverly Washington lying beside the railroad tracks in early October 1982, they weren't sure she'd survived the night. Her injuries were catastrophic. Mutilation inflicted with a knife, massive blood loss, shock, and yet she was still conscious. Barely. Though through that pain she spoke, and what she said would change everything. Her attacker, she told detectives, was a white man in his mid-20s, slender with greasy brown hair, a mustache, a flannel shirt, and square-toed boots. He drove a red van, not just any van, but one with tinted windows, a wooden divider, and hanging from the rearview mirror, feathers and a roach clip. It was a description so specific, so vivid, that detectives immediately knew they finally had a real lead. While surgeons worked to save her life, investigators stood at her bedside, recording every detail. She remembered pills forced down her throat, rape, and the moment the knife came out, when he removed her left breast and left her bleeding in the dirt. The hospital interview produced a composite sketch and the first solid description of the suspect vehicle. For the first time, police had something to chase besides the ghosts. Detectives spread out across Chicago's neighborhoods, canvassing motels, truck stops, industrial corridors, and the sex trade routes where the van had been seen. They spoke to other women working those streets, and what they heard echoed Beverly's nightmare. Angel York, another survivor, described the same type of vehicle. Cynthia Smith had fought her way out of it months earlier. Different attacks, same red van. Piece by piece, detectives built a map. Sightings, license plate fragments, witness statements, all circling the same idea. This wasn't one man acting alone. It was organized, systematic, a group operating with ritual precision across the city. Within weeks of Beverly Washington's attack, the investigation zeroed in on the western suburbs, Villa Park, and the surrounding areas, where that distinctive van had been spotted again. Detectives traced the vehicle's registration, following a paper trail that led straight to Robin Gecht, an unemployed carpenter, husband, electrician, father, and a man already known to police for sexual violence. Armed with warrants, police searched both the van and Gecht's home. Inside the vehicle, they found bloodstains, trace evidence, and marks that suggested a woman had been restrained inside. What they discovered in that house stopped even veteran investigators cold. In the attic stood a makeshift altar adorned with candles and objects arranged in a way that matched the ritual details survivors had described. It was the physical confirmation of what everyone feared. The rituals were real, and they had been happening here, inside an ordinary suburban home. From that moment, The chase was over. The hunt had found its face, Robin Gecht, and the red van that carried Chicago's darkest secrets. On October 20th, 1982, Chicago police made their first major breakthrough in the Ripper Crew investigation. That morning, detectives arrested Robin Gecht in connection with the attempted murder and mutilation of Beverly Washington, the woman who had survived to tell about the red van. The move wasn't impulsive. Detectives had methodically linked Gecht to that distinctive van through Washington's detailed hospital bed statement and a growing list of witness sightings. When the warrant came down, officers executed it cleanly. Gecht was taken into custody at his Elmhurst home without incident, while other units simultaneously searched his property for evidence. Gecht's arrest represented more than just one man in handcuffs. It was the public face of months of quiet, relentless police work. Behind the scenes, investigators had been assembling the pieces, survivor sketches, canvases of known sex work areas, and overlapping descriptions from women attacked in different neighborhoods. Every lead kept circling back to that van and to Gecht. At the house, evidence teams inspected both the vehicle and the attic. Rumors had already begun calling the space a satanic chapel, but to those first officers inside, it was only a clue, something they didn't yet fully understand. They'd boxed what they could, logged every item, and waited for the forensic results that would follow. From the start, Gecht was unreadable. During questioning between October 20th and 26th, detectives applied steady but careful pressure. He sat there, calm, cold, deflective, denying any link to Washington or to other mutilation murders that were still splashed across Chicago's headlines. When they presented Washington's detailed description of the van's interior, the feathers, the roach clip, the wooden divider, he dismissed it all. He claimed ignorance, said he was being framed, and refused to waver from that line. As forensic teams combed through his van, they started finding what they'd been waiting for: bloodstains, possible fibers from victims' clothing, and objects matching survivor testimony. Meanwhile, detectives began mapping Gecht's movements, cross-referencing his locations with dump sites and abduction zones. The overlap was undeniable. The timeline was closing in. Word of Gecht's arrest spread fast. Across Chicago's law enforcement community, departments that had spent a year chasing rumors now had a name. More survivors and witnesses began stepping forward. People who had seen the van, recognized the driver, or remembered other men who sometimes rode with him at night. Each new statement added another thread to the web connecting the small ring of suspects now living around Villa Park. Between October 20th and the 26th, Gecht remained in custody under tight watch. Detectives were cautious. They didn't want to file charges until the evidence was airtight. They built their case quietly, matching forensics to survivor statements, drawing timelines, cross-checking Gecht's alibis, and drafting warrants for the men believed to be his accomplices. Still, one thing eluded them: a confession. Gecht never cracked. He was confident, almost mocking at times, insisting that the police had the wrong man. He spoke with calm outrage for the tape recorders, even asking to see the evidence himself to, as he put it, clear up this misunderstanding. It was a performance that only deepened investigators' resolve. Behind closed doors, detectives pushed forward. They reviewed old missing persons reports, reopened unsolved homicides showing ritualistic similarities, and dug into anyone tied to Gecht. The case was expanding, not shrinking. By the end of October 26th, they still didn't have a confession, but they didn't need one to see where the trail was heading. The evidence, the witness accounts, and the survivor testimony were all pointing the same direction, toward Gecht's closest associates, the men who worked beside him, the ones who rode in that van. The next phase of the investigation was already underway. Interrogations, searches, and surveillance aimed at exposing the rest of the network. The quiet was almost over. Next, the walls start closing in on Edward Spreitzer, and the story of the Ripper Crew begins to unravel. After Robin Gecht's arrest on October 20th of 82, detectives kept him under heavy questioning why they built their case and widened the investigation to include his suspected associates. But by October 26th, with prosecutors unable to hold him on the single attempted murder charge of Beverly Washington, Gecht posted bail and walked free, an outcome that left investigators furious and uneasy. Did you have a thought over there?
Just silently cussing to myself.
Yeah. The moment he was released, law enforcement switched to high alert. Everyone knew Gecht understood exactly how close the investigation had come. Detectives feared he might intimidate witnesses, destroy evidence, or disappear altogether. Plainclothes officers began tailing him through the Villa Park area. 24-hour surveillance, every stop, every contact, logged and photographed. What had been an interrogation now became a containment operation. Gecht's release only sharpened the mission. The task force divided its focus three ways. First, keep constant tabs on Gecht's movements and his companions. Two, gather more direct evidence linking him to other assaults and homicides that match the crew's ritual pattern. And three, press survivors and witnesses for stronger testimony before fear or fatigue could silence them. Detectives re-interviewed victims, combed hospital and police records for similar cases, and coordinated with suburban departments to cross-reference every report involving a red van, ritual mutilation, or a group of white male suspects. For the first time, dozens of scattered investigations began to merge into a single picture. While the surveillance team shadowed Gecht, prosecutors and detectives quietly built the next phase of the case. They drew up warrants and refined case files for his suspected accomplices, making certain no piece of evidence could be dismantled as circumstantial. Forensic labs accelerated testing on blood, fibers, and materials recovered from Gecht's van and property, hoping the results would fill the gaps left by his refusal to confess. At the same time, police reached out to informants around Villa Park, bartenders, motel clerks, anyone who might notice changes in the behavior of men connected to Gecht. They were watching for panic, cleanup, or flight. As rumors of arrest and the release spread, the press began circling. Reporters camped outside Gecht's home, trying to photograph the suspect with the satanic attic. The pressure on police was suffocating. Inside the department, detectives worried about Beverly Washington's safety and the safety of other survivors who had risked everything to talk. Every passing hour felt like a countdown to something none of them could predict. By November 4th, 1982, the investigation reached its tipping point. Gecht was free, but only on paper. Surveillance teams never let him out of their sight, and evidence against him was multiplying by the day. Detectives began planning a coordinated strike, new warrants, simultaneous arrests, and a sweep that would finally bring in Edward Spreitzer and the Kokoraleis brothers. Motels were staked out, phone records pulled, schedules synchronized. The objective was simple: move before any member of the crew could vanish or destroy what little proof remained. Every lead, every lab result, every sleepless night had brought them to this point. The city's perpetrators were still walking free, but not for much longer. Next arrests would tear open the Ripper crew for good. November 5th, 1982, after months of blood, fear, and pursuit, the Chicago Ripper crew case finally hit its breaking point. That morning began with a coordinated series of arrests, the culmination of weeks of survivor testimony, forensic analysis, and relentless surveillance. Less than 2 weeks after walking free on bail, Robin Gecht once again found himself staring down the law. In the early hours, detectives who had shadowed him since his release moved in fast. Armed with fresh warrants, they entered his Elmhurst residence and took him into custody before dawn. The timing was deliberate, designed to stop him from destroying evidence, intimidating witnesses, or fleeing as he began to sense how close the investigators were. This time, Gecht was booked downtown not only for the attempted murder of Beverly Washington, but under suspicion for multiple homicides and ritualized assaults that had haunted the city for nearly 2 years. While Gecht was being driven toward the precinct, other teams were already in motion. In Villa Park, officers closed in on Edward Spreitzer, who was staying at a modest roadside motel, a familiar setting for the crew's late-night meetings. He was taken without resistance. According to reports, he looked confused and even asked officers if they, quote, needed help with the Gecht thing. That single line told detectives everything they needed to know about his place in the hierarchy, a follower still orbiting its leader. Across town, another unit swept in on Andrew Kokoraleis. Detectives had watched him carefully, waiting until he was alone and away from his family. They didn't want resistance, and they didn't want warning calls going out to the others. Within minutes, he too was in custody, quiet, contained, and cut off from contact. Both men were quickly separated and interrogated in isolation. Each was faced with survivor statements, crime scene photos, and forensic evidence pulled from the red van. And for the first time, investigators could look each suspected accomplice in the eye. None of this happened by chance. The November 5th raids represented a carefully choreographed alliance. Between city homicide detectives, DuPage County investigators, and a network of informants seated throughout suburban motels and bars. The goal was simple: no one warns anyone. Each arrest hit within minutes of the others. No phone calls, no tip-offs, no time to rehearse alibis. Surveillance logs from the previous 24 hours showed growing paranoia among the suspects. Their movements had become erratic. Conversations overheard by informants suggested they were afraid, even considering flight. Detectives chose that moment to strike before panic could become escape. By nightfall on November 5th, 3 men, Robin Gecht, Edward Spreitzer, and Andrew Kokoraleis, sat behind locked doors. The crew's secrecy was broken. The investigators finally had the core of the group responsible for a string of ritualistic murders and mutilations that had paralyzed Chicago since 1981. It was the turning point, born of tireless detective work and the unbreakable courage of survivors like Beverly Washington, whose testimony had led them here. What followed could test every courtroom, every confession room, and every definition of justice the city still believed in. With the arrest complete, the interrogation rooms filled with silence, a silence waiting to break. And when it did, the truth that came out would be darker than anyone imagined. It all broke on November 5th, the same day the coordinated arrest brought down the Chicago Ripper crew. Inside an interview room barely 10 feet wide, detectives sat across from Edward Spreitzer, a man whose fear of Robin Gecht still held him like a chain. What began as another round of denials would soon become the confession that changed everything. Detectives came prepared, armed with survivor testimony, forensic links, and psychological profiles built from weeks of groundwork. They knew Spreitzer's weaknesses, his dependence on Gecht, his eagerness to please, and the fear that had kept him compliant for so long. At first, he denied everything. He said he didn't know about the van, the women, or the mutilations, but hour after hour, the walls closed in. Detectives reminded him of the evidence, the blood in the van, the survivor identifications, the fact that Gecht hadn't lifted a finger to help him since the arrest. Slowly, Spreitzer's defiance began to fade. His voice softened. He admitted to, quote, doing bad things. And then he started to talk, not just in fragments or hints, but in full, horrifying detail. What came next filled 78 pages of transcript, the most chilling account detectives had ever heard. Spreitzer described the structure of the crew, the rituals, and the murders themselves. He laid out the patterns step by step: abduction, rape, mutilation, and the ceremonies that Gecht orchestrated afterwards. He told investigators how the men lured women into the red van, how Gecht acted as leader and priest, and how he and the Kokoraleis brothers followed orders. He described the use of knives, cords, and makeshift restraints, details that aligned with the forensic findings from the vehicle and the crime scenes. Spreitzer named victims one by one: Linda Sutton, Lorraine Borowski, Shwayne Mott, Sandra Delaware, Rose Davis, and others. He spoke of survivors like Beverly Washington and Angel York, whose accounts now mirrored his own admissions. Every description, the bindings, the method of mutilation, the ritual removal of breasts, matched what investigators had seen but never fully understood until that moment. Within hours, Andrew Kokoraleis also began to talk. Between his and Spreitzer's statements, the number of murders ballooned far beyond anything police had imagined, up to 17, possibly more. While some details would later prove inconsistent in timeline or location, the overarching pattern held: the red van, the ritualistic violence, the group acting under Gecht's direction. Spreitzer painted a portrait of nightly hunts through Chicago's industrial corridors, a routine of cruising, selecting, and sacrificing. To him, it was obedience. To the city, it was terror given structure. That single confession changed the entire investigation. For the first time, detectives had a detailed map of what had happened: names, dates, roles, and methods that tied together nearly 2 years of unsolved murders. The case against the crew no longer relied on rumor or fragments. It was now anchored in the words of one of its own. Prosecutors immediately began drafting formal indictments, issuing follow-up warrants, and chasing down every location Spreitzer had described. The rituals, the forensic matches, and the explicit admission of intent would soon form the backbone of every charge that followed. Edward Spreitzer's words pulled back the curtain on the Chicago Ripper crew, and once the truth was spoken, it couldn't be buried again. The next question was whether the men who followed Gecht would survive the weight of what they'd confessed to. When Andrew Kokoraleis sat down in the interrogation room on November 5th, it didn't take long for the facade to break. His confession, rapid, detailed, and disturbingly matter-of-fact, would confirm everything detectives feared about the Chicago Ripper crew and the ritual system that drove it. Andrew was swept up in the same coordinated arrest that captured Robin Gecht and Edward Spreitzer. Investigators described him as socially isolated, intellectually limited, and deeply dependent on Gecht's control. The illusion of protection vanished the moment Gecht was taken away. Within hours, both Andrew and Spreitzer began to talk, two followers whose loyalty evaporated when their leader could no longer shield them. Andrew's statement mirrored Spreitzer's in structure, but widened the lens. He implicated himself, his brother Thomas, Spreitzer, and Gecht in a campaign of ritual murder bound by what he called obedience. He confessed to taking part in or witnessing up to 17 murders, sometimes saying 18, and described a hierarchy of command where Gecht dictated every act. He told investigators how the crew cruised Chicago's red light and industrial districts, looking for women to abduct. Victims were lured into the red van, restrained, raped, stabbed, and mutilated. The weapons changed: knives, razors, even can openers. But the pattern never did. Each attack followed Gecht's script, carried out as a ritual rather than a random crime. In the murder of Rosebeck Davis, Andrew admitted riding with Gecht and Spreitzer, helping drag Davis into the van and stabbing her multiple times at Gecht's command. He recounted her rape and mutilation in detail that later matched autopsy findings and survivor accounts almost word for word. When shown photographs of Lorraine Borowski, Andrew didn't hesitate. He pointed to her picture and said, quote, "That's the girl Eddie Spreitzer and I killed in the cemetery," end quote. He described the location, the wounds, the mutilation, all aligning precisely with forensic evidence and the crew's unmistakable signature. Andrew's confession came not as one statement, but as a series of overlapping interviews, each adding new names, tools, and places. His tone stayed subdued, even submissive. At moments, he sounded remorseful, more often simply resigned. He spoke of obeying Gecht as though it were law, describing the murders as required, the violence as ritual duty. Where Spreitzer offered volume, Andrew supplied precision, the small, verifiable details that allowed detectives to stitch the case together. By November the 14th, prosecutors filed formal charges against Andrew Kokoraleis and Edward Spreitzer for the murders of Rose Davis and Lorraine Borowski. Their confessions interlocked perfectly, each corroborating the other and both placing Robin Gecht at the center of the killings. Andrew's early cooperation gave investigators their clearest inside view yet, how the crew functioned, how fear and devotion kept it alive, and why it had taken nearly 2 years for anyone to speak. What began as a string of missing women had now been exposed for what it was, a ritual enterprise of murder hidden in plain sight. With Andrew Kokoraleis' confession on record, the ritual was no longer rumor, it was evidence. And for the first time, the story of Chicago's Ripper crew had a beginning, a middle, and the promise of a reckoning. Between November 5th and November 12th, while detectives processed confessions from Edward Spreitzer and Andrew Kokoraleis, the man they believed sat at the center of it all, Robin Gecht, was back in the interrogation room. The pressure was relentless. Detectives hoped the domino effect of the others breaking would finally bring down the one that they all called the leader. The odds seemed insurmountable for Gecht. Investigators had survivor identifications, forensic evidence, and a 78-page confession from Spreitzer that placed him at the top of the Ripper crew's hierarchy. But Gecht didn't flinch. He looked at the photographs of the victims and said nothing. Detectives described him as showing no interest, no recognition, zero emotion. He denied knowing any of the women. He denied knowing about the van. He denied the killings, the mutilations, and the rituals described in excruciating detail by his accomplices. Even when detectives laid out evidence piece by piece, Gecht's answer never changed. I don't know anything about that. He sat calmly, sometimes with a faint smirk, as detectives threw everything they had at him. Each time, the words hit the wall of his composure and slid off without leaving a mark. Gecht's demeanor unnerved even the most experienced interrogators. He wasn't shaken, wasn't angry, just detached. One investigator later said it felt like he enjoyed the power of withholding the truth. They tried confrontation, empathy, long silences. Nothing worked. At one point, detectives placed him where he could see Spreitzer being questioned, hoping that the sight of his follower confessing would break his control. It didn't. Gecht sat still, cold and unmoved. His indifference had an almost hypnotic effect on those around him. The reaction was immediate and unexpected. When Spreitzer caught a glimpse of Gecht, the man who had already given them 78 pages of confession began to unravel. His tone changed. His confidence evaporated. He started recanting portions of what he'd said, shifting blame toward Andrew Kokoraleis and softening his accusations against Gecht. Even in custody, separated by concrete walls, Gecht's control still held. That strange, cult-like dynamic, his dominance and their obedience, hadn't broken with the arrests. It lingered in every room, in every interview, in every attempt to pull the truth from the men who followed him. Detectives had torn apart every alibi, every lie, every inch of Gecht's world, but they couldn't tear apart his silence. He never confessed, not once. And as the investigations pressed forward, that silence became its own kind of weapon, shielding him, manipulating others, and turning the case into one of the most chilling displays of psychological control Chicago has ever seen. By November 12th, 82, 1 week after the coordinated arrest that brought down Robin Gecht, Edward Spreitzer, and Andrew Kokoraleis, investigators were ready for the final move. The search now centered on Thomas Kokoraleis, the last name on the list and the last link in the chain that had terrorized Chicago for nearly 2 years. Detectives tracked the Kokoraleis brothers through a forwarding address left at the Rip Van Winkle Motel, a place chillingly close to where Linda Sutton, the crew's earliest known victim, had been found. The connection wasn't lost on investigators. They watched the brothers quietly, taking note of their patterns, their contacts, and their daily routines. Every moment was logged, every sighting timed. The goal was simple: bring Thomas in after the others were secured, when the full weight of the evidence and his brother's arrest couldn't be ignored. Detectives located Thomas Kokoraleis at his home. When they approached and started asking questions, his answers didn't add up. He hesitated, contradicted himself, and stumbled through details he should have known. The inconsistencies were enough. Following standard procedure for a homicide investigation, officers escorted him downtown for further questioning. He didn't resist. He didn't demand a lawyer or ask what it was all about. He just went with them, quiet, uncertain, and unaware that the net had already closed around him. At just 23, Thomas Kokoraleis seemed an unlikely figure in a case this depraved. He had no prior record, worked as a house painter, and was described by both family and later attorneys as slow-witted. Psychological evaluations would put his IQ at 75, placing him in the borderline range of intellect. Those who knew him called him naive, a man easily led, traits that would become central to his defense in the years ahead. To police that night, though, he was simply the missing piece, the quiet brother whose name kept surfacing in statements, the man who might finally connect every thread of the investigation. With Thomas Kokoraleis in custody, the map of the Chicago Ripper crew was complete. 4 men, 1 van, and a ritual of murder that had stalked Chicago's streets since 1981. The next step would come under fluorescent light when the final interviews began and the last story was told. After his arrest on November 12th, Thomas Kokoraleis unraveled almost instantly. He was nervous from the start, his hands shaking, his eyes darting across the interview room as detectives settled in. He had already failed a polygraph, and now the questions were coming fast, layered with the evidence and the names of the men that he once trusted. At first, he said he just wanted to help his brother Andrew, but soon the truth spilled out like something he couldn't hold back anymore. Within hours, the mask fell away. Thomas Kokoraleis wasn't defiant or angry. He was frightened and lost. Detectives reminded him of the survivor testimonies, the confessions already on record, and the evidence pulled from the van. The pressure wasn't just strategic, it was psychological. Every mention of his brother, every reminder of Gecht's betrayal, pushed him closer to collapse. And then he began to talk. He spoke about things no one in the room would forget, acts that even the most seasoned investigators would later say made their stomachs turn. When asked why he went along with it, Thomas didn't hesitate. Quote, "You just have to do it," he told them. He believed Robin Gecht had powers, that refusing him wasn't just dangerous, it was impossible. That belief wasn't new. It matched what his brother and Spreitzer had already confessed. Gecht's control was total, psychological, emotional, and spiritual. Thomas wasn't the mastermind, he was the follower. A 23-year-old man with an IQ of 75, described by psychologists as profoundly suggestible. But suggestible or not, what he described next was unmistakably real. He told detectives about Gecht's attic, the one that others called the Satanic Chapel, candles, an altar, the smell of wax and rot. He described women being tortured with knives and ice picks, how Gecht used a wire garrote or a piano wire to remove their breasts. Reading from the Satanic Bible as he worked, he said the severed flesh was sometimes cut into small pieces and eaten, part of what Gecht called their communion. He said they were ordered to masturbate into the tissue afterwards, an act Gecht demanded as proof of loyalty. And when asked about the aftermath, Thomas told them about a wooden box Gecht kept, a trophy chest that once held what he estimated were around 15 breasts. The detectives who heard it said the room felt colder after he finished. The horror was no longer abstract. It had structure, steps, a ritual process they could finally trace. When shown photographs of the victims, Thomas didn't hesitate. He pointed to Lorraine Borowski and said she was one of the women that he and Andrew had abducted, raped, and killed. He recognized Linda Sutton as well, identifying her as one of the earliest victims. His recollections matched the forensic evidence, the wounds, the mutilations, even the order of events. Everything aligned with what the others had already described. Thomas Kokoraleis' confession didn't just echo what detectives already knew. It filled in the blanks. It explained the rituals, the hierarchy, and the belief system that turned four men into instruments of terror. It was the moment the investigation's final curtain lifted, revealing not just the crimes, but the darkness that drove them. By mid-November 1982, the walls had finally closed around the Chicago Ripper crew. The confessions were on tape, the evidence was cataloged, and now, after 2 years of terror, the law was ready to speak. But even here, at the moment when justice should have been simple, the truth fractured into four very different paths. Thomas Kokoraleis, date of arrest, November 12, 1982. Initial charge, the murder of Lorraine Borowski, filed the same day he was taken into custody. Indictment, formally indicted by grand jury on November 16, 1982. Thomas's confession had been immediate and devastating. He described the crew's ritual mutilations and so-called satanic chapel and the acts of cannibalism and sexual desecration that formed the backbone of the group's ceremonies. His testimony gave prosecutors the connective tissue they needed, linking names, places, and methods into a single prosecutable form of ritual murder. Andrew Kokoraleis, date of arrest, between November 5th and November 7th of 82. The initial charges, jointly charged with Edward Spreitzer for the murder and rape of Rose Davis on November the 14th, 82. Bond status, indicted and ordered held without bond within 3 days of arrest. Andrew's confession expanded the body count, describing his role in up to 17 murders, including the killings of Rose Beck Davis and Lorraine Borowski. His words provided both validation and horror, the timeline of 2 years of methodical, ritualistic killings carried out under Gecht's influence. Edward Spreitzer, date of arrest, November 5th, 1982. Initial charges, with Andrew Kokoraleis for the murder and rape of Rose Davis, filed on November the 14th, 1982. Further indictments, later named in a separate indictment for the murder of Lorraine Borowski. Spreitzer's 78-page confession remained the cornerstone of the prosecution. 7 murders, 1 aggravated battery, each crime explained in sequence, each scene detailed with precision. His testimony not only condemned himself, but built the case against every other man in the crew. Robin Gecht, the ringleader, date of second arrest, November 5th, 1982. Initial charges, none for homicide. For all the accusations, no direct physical evidence ever tied Gecht to the murders. Even with 3 men naming him as the leader, prosecutors couldn't link him to the killings beyond the confession testimony. And that wasn't enough for a murder charge. Instead, they built their case on the one survivor who had lived to face him, Beverly Washington. Gecht was indicted for a series of felonies connected to her assault: attempted murder, rape, deviant sexual assault, aggravated kidnapping, aggravated battery. He never confessed, not to police, not in court. In every interview, he maintained his innocence, cold, detached, and utterly consistent. By the end of November, the dividing lines were clear. 3 men confessed to murder. 1 man, the one they called the leader, did not. For prosecutors, the goal was no longer just conviction. It was survival in court. Every confession would be tested, every statement dissected, and every gap in the physical evidence would matter. Because in the months ahead, the ritual of justice would begin, one just as deliberate and far more enduring than the horrors that brought them here. The case against the Chicago Ripper crew wasn't built on DNA or fingerprints. There were no clean ballistic hits, no single piece of forensic gold. What prosecutors had instead was something darker, a web of confessions, ritual, and cooperation. Every survivor's account, every autopsy note, every detail kept secret from the press formed a pattern too precise to ignore. The pattern was ritual, and it became the foundation of the case. The crew's signature was unmistakable: the amputation of a woman's left breast. That single detail appeared again and again across victims: Linda Sutton, Lorraine Borowski, Sandra Delaware, Rose Davis, and each one bore the same wound pattern. Forensic examiners confirmed that the cuts were deliberate, measured, and unique. It was a detail police never released to the public, yet every confession repeated it. Confessions described piano wire or garrote wire used to perform the amputations, matching wound morphology across several victims. Autopsy findings aligned perfectly with what the suspects had said under interrogation. The individual scenes told the rest of the story. Lorraine Borowski, stabbed over 80 times. Her wounds consistent with the suspect's claims, including the use of a glass axe. Linda Sutton, bound with handcuffs, gagged, both breasts removed, her body decomposed at an unnatural rate because of the massive chest wounds. Sandra Delaware, wrist tied behind her back with a shoelace, bra twisted around her neck, matching the confession details exactly. Rose Davis, beaten to death with blunt trauma to the face, wounds from a hatchet lined up with what the suspects described. A rifle recovered from Robin Gecht's apartment matched ballistics from the drive-by murder of Rafael Tirado, the crew's only known male victim. Each forensic link was circumstantial on its own, but together, the mosaic was unmistakable. The prosecution's backbone wasn't just blood or wounds, it was people. Beverly Washington, left for dead beside the tracks, had survived to describe her attacker and his van. Her account gave detectives the blueprint: a red van with tinted windows, a wooden divider, small personal details, a feather and a roach clip hanging from the mirror. Those same features were confirmed by multiple witnesses once police seized the vehicle. Andrea York, another survivor, described being handcuffed, assaulted, and thrown from the same red van months earlier. Her details, right down to how she'd been restrained, matched Beverly's story and confirmed the crew operated as a group. Detectives also traced the men to the Rip Van Winkle motel, where they had rented side-by-side rooms. The motel stood just a few hundred yards from Linda Sutton's dump site. Managers recalled strange rituals and late-night gatherings. It was here that the first whispers of the cult connection began to sound less like rumor and more like evidence. At Lorraine Borowski's workplace, investigators found her scattered personal effects, shoes, keys, and purse contents, just as the suspects described in their confessions. The placement proved abduction, confirming their version of events with chilling accuracy. The investigation's most disturbing confirmations came not from the streets, but from the suspects' own homes. When police searched Gecht's attic, they found what the men had called the Satanic Chapel. The room was outfitted exactly as described: red and black crosses painted on the walls, candles, and an altar draped in red cloth. Detectives also found a wooden box consistent with the one Thomas Kokoraleis described, a trophy chest that once held severed breasts. It contained suspicious stains and fatty residue, though no viable DNA could be recovered, and it was long before DNA was a thing.
Yeah.
Even without biological proof, its discovery aligned too precisely with the ritual accounts to be coincidence. Other confessions described specific acts: forced cannibalism, masturbation into the wounds, and the insertion of foreign objects, including the rock and the wine bottle found during Sarah Delaware's autopsy. Each grisly element matched forensic reports point for point. Investigators also seized satanic books, ritual objects, and occult paraphernalia from the defendants' apartments. Together, these items gave physical shape to the crew's psychological landscape, a landscape where murder was ceremony and obedience was faith. The evidence room couldn't hold what this case represented. Every photograph, every lab report, every confession lined up to reveal the same thing: a pattern of cruelty so deliberate it blurred the line between homicide and ritual sacrifice. And in the courtroom waiting ahead, the challenge for prosecutors would be clear: to take the tangible horrors of belief and fear and translate them into the tangible language of law. By late 1982 and into 1983, the Chicago Ripper Crew case had shifted from interrogation rooms to courtrooms. The confessions were explosive, the press coverage was relentless, and now both sides were racing to define the story that jurors would hear. It wasn't just a fight for justice anymore, it was a war of strategy. The prosecution's first priority was corroboration. The trio of confessions from Edward Spreitzer and the Kokoraleis brothers had to hold up under the weight of scrutiny. Detectives revisited every autopsy, every crime scene, and every ritual detail, matching statements and physical reality. The breast amputations, chest wounds, findings, and the recovered ritual paraphernalia. Every verifiable overlap became another thread in the state's case. Their strongest human evidence was Beverly Washington, the woman who had survived what so many others hadn't. Her identification of Robin Gecht, the red van, and the precise details of its interior gave the prosecution something no confession could: living proof. Investigators backed that with hard context. They documented that all four suspects had rented adjoining rooms at the Rip Van Winkle Motel, not far from Linda Sutton's dump site. They photographed Gecht's attic, the so-called Satanic Chapel, and cataloged its ritual layout. Inside, they logged the trophy box, the rifle tied to Rafael Tirado's murder, and satanic books and symbols, each piece bolstering the narrative of organized ritual violence. Each man faced separate indictments, but the prosecution structure was clear. If every confession could stand, each defendant could reinforce the others, and together they could prove the pattern. The defense struck back hard and fast. Their target, the confessions themselves. For Thomas and Andrew Kokoraleis, attorneys filed motions claiming police coercion and false promises of leniency, arguing that detectives had manipulated their clients into confessing by suggesting that they be treated as witnesses and not as killers. They pointed to their clients' borderline IQ scores, 74 to 76, and claimed vulnerability, confusion, and intimidation. Both men underwent competency evaluations but were ruled fit to stand trial. Robin Gecht's defense tried a different route: insanity. His attorneys argued that he was delusional, detached from reality, and unfit to understand his actions. But after psychiatric exams on March 2nd, the court ruled that he was sane and fully aware at the time of the crimes. Some defense strategies leaned towards dismantling the ritual motive itself. They called the satanic details fantasy, a collective hallucination among weak minds desperate to please interrogators. Others shifted the blame entirely to Gecht, describing him as a manipulative cult leader whose supernatural hold over his followers turned them into unwilling accomplices. In hearing after hearing, judges weighed the admissibility of the confessions. Defense attorneys argued coercion, exhaustion, and deceit. Prosecutors countered with transcripts, consistency, and cooperation. Ultimately, the rulings favored the state. The confessions would stand. Psychiatric defenses rose and fell. Gecht's insanity plea was denied after multiple evaluations, and the courts declared all four men mentally competent, no matter how diminished their intellect or their strange beliefs. Bond hearings came next. All three confessed participants were held on $1 million bond or none at all, while media attention surged to the point of threatening jury integrity. Judges issued partial gag orders, limiting what prosecutors and attorneys could say outside the courtroom. Inside those walls, the groundwork was clear. The prosecution would tell a story of ritual murder and coordinated sadism, while the defense would paint a picture of manipulation, delusion, and coercion. When the prosecutors stepped into the courtroom, they leaned into the cult, the satanic chapel, the ritual objects, and the eerie uniformity of the wounds became their unifying theory, a psychological and physical signature that no jury could dismiss as coincidence. It wasn't just murder, they argued. It was worship, a system of ritualized violence carried out in service of one man's depravity and sustained by fear. By the start of 1983, the stage was set. The confessions were admissible. The sanity hearings were over, and the city that had watched the crew's arrest would now watch the system try to explain them. The next battle would decide what justice looked like for the women they left behind, and whether the courts could convict a man who led a cult without ever confessing to a single murder. By the close of 1982, the men who called themselves the Ripper Crew were finally in custody, broken apart by their own words, their own fear, and the sheer gravity of what they'd done. Chicago police had the confessions, the ritual evidence, and the survivors' testimony. What they didn't have was closure, because the more the case unfolded, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about murder. It was about control, psychological, sexual, and spiritual, a system built around one man's dominance and three others' submission. They didn't just kill to silence their victims, they killed to obey. Detectives had seen serial killers before. They'd seen greed, lust, revenge, and rage. But the Ripper Crew was different. There was no money, no feud, no profit, just ritual and obedience. Every crime had choreography, every mutilation, meaning. And at the center sat Robin Gecht, a man who never confessed, never flinched, and never let go of the control he built. The Kokoraleis brothers and Edward Spreitzer told investigators everything, every ritual, every scream, every weapon. Their stories lined up too perfectly to be coincidence, yet still the question lingered. Were they puppets, or were they willing participants in a cult built on Gecht's delusion of power? As the charges rolled in, Chicago tried to make sense of what it had just witnessed. 4 ordinary men, construction workers, husbands, neighbors, had spent 2 years terrorizing women in a city that never even knew a pattern existed. At least 15 victims, 2 survivors, and a trail of evidence that looked more like a satanic ritual than a conventional homicide case. Behind the headlines, prosecutors and detectives knew this case would test the system itself. How do you prove evil when the leader leaves no fingerprints, no DNA, and no confession? Just a trail of broken followers and unspeakable acts carried out in his name. The arrests had stopped the killings, but justice, that was just beginning. Because when the trials came, the truth wouldn't just be about who committed the murders, it would be about who controlled them. Before the courtrooms, before the sentences, there were the women. Names that barely made the evening news. Faces that disappeared between city lights and alley shadows. They were daughters, mothers, friends, and survivors, each one pulled into a nightmare that most of Chicago never knew was happening until it was far too late. The first was Linda Sutton, 28 years old, abducted in May of 1981. Her body was found behind a motel 10 days later, mutilated, her life reduced to evidence tags and autopsy photographs. For detectives, she became the blueprint. For the rest of us, she was the beginning of something no one could yet name. Then came the unnamed cocktail waitress, 35, stranded after her car ran out of gas. No name, no headlines, just the same brutal signature. She reminds us that anonymity can be the cruelest wound of all. Lori Borowski, 21, walked to work one spring morning and never arrived. Her body was found months later in a cemetery, stabbed, tortured, left beneath the same ground where the others would one day mourn her. Her death would anchor the case, her name whispered in every courtroom that followed. Shui Moff, 30 years old, a woman on her way home in Hanover Park. She never made it back. Her remains surfaced months later at a construction site, bones and silence found together. Sandra Delaware, barely 18. Her body lay along the Chicago River, wrist tied, bra knotted under her throat. She was still a teenager, but her story was told in evidence photographs labeled adult female. Rosebeck Davis, 31, killed only weeks later, her face crushed, her body left in an alley. The details of her death would echo through every confession that followed. And then there was Rafael Tirado, 28, the crew's only known male victim. A man shot in cold blood. His life ended because violence had become casual to his killers. Not everyone died. Some lived, scarred, silenced, but alive. Angel York survived a night inside the red van. Handcuffed, cut, and thrown into the dark, she somehow found the will to crawl back into the world and tell her story. Beverly Washington, her courage changed everything. Left for dead by the railroad tracks, her breast amputated, her body butchered, she lived and she spoke. Her testimony broke the case wide open. Because of Beverly, the monsters were named. Alberto Rosario, wounded but breathing, became the only man to walk away from their gunfire. And then there was Cynthia Smith and the unnamed black woman, both attacked, both escaped, both carrying the kind of trauma that never quite ends. But the list doesn't stop there. The confessions spoke of unnamed women, a black woman chained and thrown into the river, a Hispanic woman left with bite marks and desecration that defied understanding. Names the police never matched to files, women who never made it home, and families who never even knew to look. There was Carol Pappas, the wife of the Chicago Cubs pitcher, found 5 years later in her car. Her death ruled an accident, but her name tangled forever in the crew's confessions. Then was Susan Baker, 22, whose body was found after the arrest, her murder echoing the same ritual pattern. And Lorraine Baez, whose name surfaced in a confession only to be dismissed for details that didn't fit, but whose absence still lingers in the timeline. And then there were the others, the women who were never identified, never found, never even searched for. 15 severed breasts, Thomas Kokoraleis said. Each one once belonged to someone with a heartbeat, a voice, and a story. When the records list unknown female, we have to remember she was known to someone, a friend, a daughter, a name whispered in a prayer that never got answered. This case was never just about the killers. It was about the women who endured the unendurable and the survivors who turned their trauma into testimony strong enough to shatter a cult. So tonight, we say their names and we remember the ones who never had a chance to tell theirs. May they all rest in peace, and may the world never look away again. You've been listening to Dark Dialogue, where we explore the crimes that haunt small towns and big cities alike. Tonight, we trace the arrests, the confessions, and the relentless investigation that finally exposed the Ripper crew. But behind every file, every name, and every confession are the lives they stole and the voices they couldn't silence.
If this episode moved you, help us keep those voices heard. Tap like, follow, give it a thumbs up, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Leave a review on your podcast app. Every rating helps these stories reach someone who might still be searching for answers.
You can also join the Dark Dialogue Collective, our boots-on-the-ground organization providing real-time support through search efforts, family assistance, and victim advocacy nationwide. Or get involved through our Adoptive Victim program, where listeners research unsolved cases and help bring answers to families who've waited too long.
To support our work and keep these episodes coming, you can become a member on Patreon or buy us a coffee on Ko-fi. Every contribution goes towards production, research, and field efforts through the collective. And for in-depth case notes, behind-the-scenes breakdowns, and early releases, follow us on Substack.
All links and resources are at www.darkdialogue.com. Questions, case suggestions, kudos, or anything else, email us at info@darkdialogue.com. We read every message because every story matters.
Each episode is more than a story. It's a reminder that truth only survives when we keep talking about it.
Keep searching, keep questioning, keep remembering, and above all, keep the dialogue alive.